You'll be able to find that on our website. And we're also going to go ahead and send out a link to that recording as well. Second, questions. We absolutely love questions. We've all at this point probably spent a great deal of time in Zoom, and you can see that there is a chat box for you to talk with your peers, but there's also a Q&A area if you want to drop some questions in there or in the chat. We're going to do most of those questions at the end, but if there's something that needs clarity as we go along to help you kind of grasp what we're talking about, go ahead and pop that in, and then we'll make sure that Susan addresses it as we go along. All right. I am extremely excited to have with us my colleague here at Pragmatic and the lead instructor of our Pragmatic data practice, Susan Gracia. Susan has over 20 years of experience in education research and evaluation consulting, conducting analytics, assessment, and evaluation for organizations inside and outside of the US. She's also a passionate teacher on the topic. She's been a professor in Peru for 8 years. She taught in Boston. She served as director of assessment at both Rhode Island College and Simmons College, where she worked to kind of identify KPIs and data tracking processes. She's developed and delivered training at all levels and is just really, really passionate about helping both individuals and organizations on their path to data maturity. So in short, we are in very, very good hands today. And so Susan, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So thanks for the introduction. I'm glad to see so many people online. I'm glad there are a lot of people who are interested in data maturity and how we can measure it and how to build it within our organizations. So I'd like to start by orienting you to what we'll be talking about today. And first, I'm going to start by really defining data maturity. What is it? And more importantly, why is it important? Why are we even concerned about data maturity within our organizations? Second, I'll focus on the common stages of data maturity within organizations. After that, I will present what we call the pillars of data maturity. What the things that your organization needs to have in place to be considered data mature and to benefit from data maturity. And then lastly, we'll talk about some strategies that you can use to boost your organization's data maturity, because in all likelihood, there are some areas where your organization could potentially improve or grow in terms of data maturity. So before we talk about data maturity, let's talk about data. It's important to provide some context around data maturity, and I think data is a good place to start. We hear a lot about data these days, and when I think of data, I really define data myself as facts and statistics and information collected about people, places, things, businesses, events, all of the things that happen during the operation of our businesses. And in reality, it's also one of an organization's most valuable assets. And that's why it's sometimes compared to other items of great value like oil or gold or currency. And you may have heard some of these sayings that you can see on the screen. I think probably the most famous of these is that data is the new oil. But in fact, data is something that every company produces. And because of this, data is reshaping business operations and enabling new revenue streams all across the global economy. Soon, data itself will become a primary product for nearly every business, and data analytics and data science will form the core of every company's business model. And that's why there's another saying nowadays that I think is very relevant, and that is that every company is a data company, whether they realize it or not. And one reality about data is that if it is not used, it has no value. Just as oil is not valuable until it's refined, data becomes valuable only when it's used. So that's where the term data-driven comes in. And the value that we commonly associate with data doesn't occur until it's used or harnessed for decision-making. And in fact, that's what being data-driven means. And organizations that are data-driven base their decisions on the analysis of data instead of intuition or gut feeling or experience or how we've always done it or rank or seniority or a host of other features. And there's also plenty of empirical evidence that data-driven organizations are more successful than companies that do not rely on data to guide their decisions. And organizations that use data well experience significant benefits. including greater revenue from improved performance and outcomes, saved money and cost savings due to increased efficiency, improved products and services because they understand their customers better, and a host of other benefits, some of which that you can see on the screen. And the concept of data maturity is related to the concept of being data-driven. And data maturity is a term that we use to understand the degree to which an organization has the required elements in place to be data-driven. So data maturity is a feature of an organization, not individuals. So we don't say, I'm data mature or you're data mature. We speak of an organization being data mature or having data maturity. And in general, it can be described as how well or the degree to which an organization uses and makes the most of its data. But what does this look like? On the one hand, it means that data is fully embedded in an organization. People talk about data in meetings and discussions and daily activities. Data is everywhere, so to speak. All decision-making in a data mature organization is data-driven. And data is explicitly used to track and advance the organization's goals. In essence, data and analytics are a central underpinning of the business that is data mature. And I'd like to have a little bit of interaction in this webinar aside from the question and answer. So I have a question for you, and I'd love to hear from the people who are present on the webinar today. And I'm using an app called Slido. You can go to slido.com and put in the code you see here, or you can just point your camera at the QR code. But I'm just curious about you and the organizations in which you work right now. And my question to you is, on a scale of 1, not at all, to 4, very much, how well does this describe your organization? And this is the 3 points I just described. Data is embedded into all levels of the organization. Data is integrated into all decision-making, and data is consistently utilized to advance business goals. And I'll give you a little bit of time. Thank you to the people who are already responding. Nine of you have responded. Give it just a little bit of time, but one thing that's striking me right now is that 0 people so far have said that their organization is, somebody said that their organization is at the high end of that scale in terms of how data is embedded and used in their organization. More of you have said your organization is about at a 2 out of 4 than anything. 11 people have responded. I'll give just a few more seconds. But thank you to everyone who's responded. Well, I think we can talk about what we see on the screen. You can see some interesting information in the visualization that is being generated through Slido. We can see in this group, we have people who have judged the data maturity of their organizations to be at different levels of maturity. We have, it looks like probably a person who has said, my organization is not at all described by the statements on the screen. We have somebody who said, yes, my organization is very much like what we have on the screen. On the other hand, we have an even split now between people who view their organizations as kind of middle of the road, a 2 on a scale of 0 to 4 or 1 to 4, a 3 as well. And I think this is really typical, and it's something that we will talk a little bit more about as we go through the webinar. And that is that organizations around the world tend to be at different levels of data maturity. Another thing that's pretty common or has been well documented is that there aren't many organizations that are at a high level of data maturity. And in reality, the road to data maturity, it's a journey. It's a path that organizations take from perhaps, a low level of data maturity to a higher, more effective level. And the truth is that becoming a data mature organization can take a significant amount of time and effort. Look at the figures on the screen. On average, it can take 5 or more years to reach full data maturity. And that's when an organization is really making an effort to move along the road or the path to data maturity. Another striking number is that nowadays, today, only about a quarter of organizations can be considered fully data mature. We'll talk about what that means in just a few moments. And another striking statistic is that 91% of organizations have not reached what we call a transformational level of maturity in data and analytics. And by transformational, we mean that data is used to predict and create a desired feature or desired future. It's, kind of the highest of the high level of data maturity. So I want to really underscore that the journey to data maturity is one that takes time and effort, and it's not achieved overnight. And so I'd like a bit more information from you, if you'd be willing to share it with everyone who's here in the webinar. And given the fact that at least most of you said that your own organization is not at a high level of data maturity, it's not very, very much reflected by the statements that you saw. And given what I just shared about the fact that arriving at a state of data maturity is something that takes time and effort, what do you think, or from your experience, what are the main challenges that an organization faces in becoming data mature? And good, we've already got somebody who's responded. Here you can go to Slido, you can put in an open-ended response. I did forget to tell you a few minutes ago that all your responses are anonymous when you do respond to a question in Slido. So I'll give you a few more moments. Got some great responses so far. See some trends for sure. I see, oh, look at that. The biggest challenge that this group has identified is culture. And I will tell you that is, one of the major obstacles to data maturity. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Adoption is also something, that in this word cloud appears pretty big, meaning at least a few of you mentioned this as an obstacle. Be curious to learn more about that, maybe in the questions and answers. But I see other things that are common among your responses. There are a few people talking about consistency. And did I see reliability? I'm not sure, but consistency, some issues related to the data, like ownership and governance, one source of truth. We'll talk about that as well. Believers, that's a good one. That just appeared. That has to do with the momentum and enthusiasm and excitement that people in the organization have. That's data integrity. Yeah, so excellent. These excellent feedback on what you have experienced as challenges on the road to data maturity or obstacles that you've observed in your own work. And I will note again that culture appears in a big box, meaning it's viewed as kind of the major obstacle, at least by the people in the webinar. And adoption is the next biggest term in the word cloud. And I would imagine that has to do with behavior on the part of the people in the organization. adopting some of the practices of being data-driven and putting those into practice. So thank you for your input. I can see you're all familiar with some of these obstacles, and we'll talk about these in the next few minutes. So you may see your response in the circles that you can see on the screen here. And one thing I'll point out to you, and I think it was reflected in your open-ended responses too, is that the principal challenges to data maturity are not technological. Data maturity does not depend mainly or only on getting, a technological solution or system in place. On the other hand, the main challenges to data maturity have to do with culture, as you pointed out, and people and business processes. And I think I saw at least one person who wrote the word process on the other screen. And this, is again in contrast to what people sometimes assume. And that assumption is that data maturity depends on having the right data tools and data talent and data structures in place. That's really not the case. The main challenges, again, are culture, people, and business processes. And if we divide those out into a little bit more detail, the principal challenges that relate to culture and people and processes are leadership. And that would manifest itself in terms of insufficient leadership support for using data within the organization. Organizational culture, as you pointed out, is also a big challenge. And that could be described as a culture that's not conducive to being data-driven and having data embedded in really every facet of the organization. Data itself can be an obstacle to data maturity, as many of you pointed out. If that data is siloed, if it's, there's data in certain areas of the organization and data isn't shared, rather it exists in separate silos, it's not accessible to the people who would need it, that is a major obstacle to data maturity as well. And some of you mentioned governance on the previous slide, and governance has to do with who owns the data, who owns it, where does it reside, and all of these ideas are very much intertwined. You can see another challenge here, which we've called misalignment, and that means misalignment of the business and data sides of the house or of the business. And the final obstacle on the screen is data literacy. And the way in which it can be an obstacle is if there are low levels of data literacy. And I'll talk more about each of these and what they mean and what they look like in a few moments. So because of the fact that the path to data maturity can be one that requires effort and time, and because, as you saw, there can be different levels of data literacy in organization or between organizations. The reality is that data maturity exists on a continuum, and you can see a graphic representing the continuum that we use here at Pragmatic. And there are stages of little to no data maturity all the way up to fully data mature. And we use this 4-stage framework that you can see on the screen. At the low level of the continuum are the organizations that we call or classify as data naive. And in this type of an organization, data on the whole is not used very much. And the organization instead or still relies mainly on process or output or how we've always done things to make decisions. A little bit higher on the data maturity continuum are the organizations we call data conscious. These organizations have some awareness of data, the data's potential, but data tends to be used on an ad hoc basis by certain people or groups who might be early promoters of the use of data. Another feature of the data conscious organization as well is that the data that is used on an ad hoc basis tends to be used to describe what happens in the past. So the data use isn't focused on, where we are today or how we are today or how we want to be in the future, but it's a little bit more, backward looking historically. At the next stage of the data maturity continuum, we have the organizations that we call data informed. And in these organizations, there's a larger or higher level of understanding of the value of data. And data is certainly used more than at the lower levels of the continuum, but it's still not entirely consistent. In addition, the use of data in a data-informed organization tends to be limited to an improved understanding of the current state of things in the business, how we're doing now, how we're doing here, with limited views to the future. And at the highest level here, tallest level here you can see in the continuum are data decisive organizations. And in this type of organization, data is fully integrated into the organization. It's consistently used not only to understand the past and the present, but to optimize efficiency and effectiveness, and to predict and create a desired future. And that's what I was referring to a little while ago when I talked about being data decisive at a transformational level. That's when you can use the data to create a future that you envision. And at each stage, there are multiple organizational features and practices that contribute to why the business is at that particular level of data maturity. And you might ask, what is the cost of being data naive, for example, instead of data decisive? If we look at the two ends of the continuum. Well, there's a remarkable achievement gap between organizations with mature data practices versus organizations who are not data mature. And on average, data decisive organizations release twice as many products and increase employee productivity at double the rate of organizations with low levels of data maturity. Further, data decisives innovate at double the rate of the data naives. They also enter new markets and increase customer wallet share at nearly twice the rate of data naives. Employee productivity of data decisives is also almost double that of data naives. And finally, data decisives are almost twice as likely to be directly monetizing their data, making money from it. So here I'm, contrasting the highest and the lowest levels of the continuum, but you can see there's a great difference in terms of achievement or performance or a return on investment if you compare these two levels or contrasting levels. So, what are the organizational features and practices that contribute to data maturity? I like to call them the pillars of data maturity. And we'll spend some time now on these pillars of data maturity, or what needs to be in place to be data mature at the organizational level. And this goes beyond simply having data or wanting to be data driven. And as I describe each of these, I'd like you to think of your own organization and the degree to which these pillars are in place. So if I turn, the obstacles that we looked at a few minutes ago kind of on their heads, these are, now we're going to be talking about the pillars. And in order for an organization to achieve data maturity, there needs to be support from leadership. And so what does it mean for leaders to support the organization in terms of data? One thing that is very important is that leaders model behaviors around using data to make decisions. They need to demonstrate that data informs their own decisions. And that if you read about data maturity, hopefully if you've experienced it as well, this shows up again and again and again, that modeling on the part of leaders is absolutely essential. So when they describe their decisions or talk about the decisions they make, they should also make clear the data that informed their decisions. Another practice of leadership that really fosters data maturity is for leaders to recognize and reinforce employee behaviors that are reflective of data use. So if the leader sees other employees or groups perhaps using data very effectively and be operating in a data-driven way, it's really important for the leader to highlight these particular employees or the practices that they are using. And I've seen organizations, where there are contests around data analysis and use, with prizes where different units or different work groups share what they're doing around data, and then leadership will recognize them in some way that highlights to the organization that this is really an important practice. Other things that I've seen too is recognition of exemplary data practice on the part of employees or work groups on maybe the company website or newsletters or other means. Leadership in a data mature organization also believes that employees are capable and can be trusted with the data that they need to drive the organization forward. And this means that when employees use data to generate insights, they're empowered to make decisions that are relevant to their role. And they don't have to stop and, in a sense, have their hands tied and ask permission to act. So that empowerment is very important. Another feature of leadership in a data mature organization is that the leaders are concerned with data from many areas of the organization. For example, not just sales data or profit data. Of course, these are important, but the leader in a data mature organization also is aware that other types of data impact not only the bottom line, but maybe the culture of the organization, employee satisfaction, perhaps customer engagement. So they would also be concerned with and aware of human resources data, marketing data, and data that from other areas that contribute to the performance of the business. And from my own experience, I've worked in organizations that are on their way to becoming data-driven, and I've seen firsthand the impact that leadership in this area can have. And I could share with you just a few details about an experience that I had in an organization where I was actually director of assessment, and we had worked as an organization under the leadership of, I think, a really strong leader for a few years. And I think we'd gone not from 0 to 100 in terms of data maturity, but we were getting there, 50, maybe 0 to 75 if we're comparing it to the speed of a car. And there was a change of leadership, and the new leader that was brought in honestly did not believe in data and made it quite clear in all of his conversations and written and other forms of communication with the employees in the organization. And this is kind of an unfortunate example, but all of the momentum that we had in working towards being data mature, it was just stopped. It came to a screeching halt. And when the modeling of these behaviors, the recognition, the reinforcement, the trust and the confidence, all of these things were removed, the data maturity of the organization totally stalled and I think backslid. The leadership has an extremely strong role. The organization that is data mature also has certain values that it espouses and lives by. First of all, a data mature organization values agility and experimentation and gives employees and staff the freedom to be agile, to kind of change plans or make changes in projects and experiment with new ideas. And the data mature organization is also aware that failure is necessary before real innovation or growth is possible. The data mature organization is also open to learning and adapting based on what the data tells them. It's not threatened by hearing unflattering findings or suggestions that changes need to be made. Sometimes these things can be a little bit, difficult to hear, but the data mature organization realizes that unpleasant news, so to speak, in terms of findings or data results can be used to change and become better. The data mature organization is also results oriented with a focus on outcomes and not just kind of process or output or the way we've done things before. And it also encourages staff to generate and test their own data supported hypotheses and to question the status quo. And one way that I've seen that exhibited in some organizations I have worked for, particularly in terms of generating hypotheses and questioning the status quo, is in some of the organizations that I've had experience in, we have held yearly or maybe twice yearly, data sessions or data day, we call them data days, for members of the organization who worked with data or had an interest in data, where we would share data from the organization and reflect on it and think of what it meant and maybe how we could act on it. And prior to viewing the data in a data session, we would ask employees, what do you think you'll see in the data and why? Because as members of an organization, we do have some intuitions maybe on what the data might look like. We might have some biases in terms of what we think we'll see. We certainly have some knowledge that can be helpful. But by asking people, what do you think you'll see and why do you think you'll see that, it encourages people to generate hypotheses, test them when they can see if maybe their hypotheses were correct, and perhaps begin to question some of their own understandings or some of their beliefs about how the company should operate and what the status quo might mean. Data mindset is also important in a data mature organization, and it obviously connects strongly with the values of an organization. And in a data mature organization, data is viewed as a core asset, an asset that's essential to growth and to success. It's not just something that is nice to have, or maybe that's being imposed on us. And from my experience as well, I have worked in organizations where there have been mandates that all employees and all groups should now start to use data. We need to become data driven. And again, this has often been without modeling from leadership. But I have learned that when data is used to comply with mandates or maybe to comply with external regulatory bodies or accreditors in an educational situation, people may try to make it look like they're working with data, but it's not truly viewed as a core business asset. So working on viewing data as something that really can help us grow and succeed, as opposed to something we have to do or somebody else is telling us, will certainly improve the data maturity of the organization and foster an idea that data is really an important asset. In a data mature organization as well, data use is a requirement and a priority for everyone in the business, but not seen as onerous because data is also viewed as a core business asset, essential to growth and success. Data is also regarded as the primary tool for decision-making by the entire data mature organization. And employees at all levels are curious and willing to challenge assumptions with data. And this also means questioning what the data might tell us, as I said before, even if it leads to some uncomfortable conversations. And again, I'm going to link this to the leadership pillar because in my experience, this data mindset is not achievable unless staff see this also from the top. It's not effective to mandate or tell employees to value data if it's not demonstrated by the people that they respect and look up to and who are the true leaders in an organization. This perhaps, what you see on the screen, data access, is perhaps the most technical of the data maturity requirements or pillars that I'll talk about today. And this is definitely something that some of you identified at the beginning of the webinar. But in order for an organization to be considered data mature, staff have to have access to the data. They need to be able to get it when they need it. They need to be able to know where to find it. We can't expect people to use data or make data-driven decisions if they can't get the data or they have to wait weeks for it. It's also important that that data be clean and high quality and from a central source. And I saw somebody in the other discussion mention single source of truth. And that's what I'm talking about here, from a central source. It's important that there be a master data set or a single source of truth for each element of data that's used in an organization. So for example, if you have sales data, there needs to be one source of truth for the sales data that everyone uses when they're analyzing the data. I have experience just in my previous workplaces where people in multiple departments are analyzed what they thought was the same data in one, or in an educational setting. Sometimes we look at student achievement data, and people in a program would have their student achievement data. The university would have another set of achievement data. We all thought we were using the same data, but we got different results because we were using different versions of it. And we don't have that in an organization that is really data mature. There's one central source from which we get the data that we're looking for. Also, and I think I've alluded to this already, staff need to be able to easily access the data that they need to perform their daily work. This also helps people collaborate across teams and share data from multiple functional areas. And I have seen great momentum in the terms of excitement about using data and, becoming data mature in some of the places where I've worked. But then when excited, employees who have a question they want to answer or a problem they want to solve, when they look for the data or they request it and they're told they need to wait 3 weeks to get the data, that level of enthusiasm drops to the floor. They're forced to make decisions without the data because usually the problems we need to solve need to be solved right away. So I can't underscore enough the importance of having data accessible in a kind of a practical, user-friendly way to employees. Finally, it's also important that there are processes in place to prevent and to mitigate data-related ethical and privacy concerns as well. This doesn't mean anybody everywhere can have all sorts of data. Some of you or someone mentioned data governance in the earlier slide, and there need to be rules in terms of who owns data, who has access to data. We must be conscious of that. In my experience, however, some people or departments can become very protective of what they consider to be their data. And so you need to distinguish between protectiveness or territorialism and the respective privacy issues and things like that. Another important pillar of data maturity is alignment. And in less data mature organizations, data and business teams don't necessarily speak the same language. They can also become frustrated with each other, which is pretty detrimental. Data teams can be frustrated because maybe their reports and findings are never used. And business people on the other side of the house, they're frustrated because they don't understand perhaps the frameworks or methodologies the data teams use. They don't know how to ask the right questions of the data team, or maybe they're given reports or results that they can't use and maybe don't know how to interpret. So it's important for the business leaders and the data teams to share a common language and framework around data. And people on the business side need to take an active role and participate in the design and the monitoring and the sharing of insights from the data project. The data team does, a lot of the analysis and presentation of results, but there's a role for the business people at each stage of the process to make sure that the business perspective is included. And that means that the data people and the business people understand their contribution to data projects and how best to support each other. And finally, data questions and success measures should be tied to business goals and metrics and current business realities, that metrics that are important to the business. Sometimes we find that the data teams use metrics that are really pertinent to data science, but they might not be easily translated to impact on the business. And this is an area we focus on a lot at Pragmatic. And the final pillar that I'll mention today is data literacy. And data literacy is a skill that everyone who works with or interacts data should have. And there are many definitions of data literacy, but what they tend to have in common is the ability to read or locate data, work with data. That could be cleaning data, preparing data, analyzing data, and or communicating with data. And I say and or for a reason. And there are different levels of data literacy, and employees should have the appropriate level of data literacy for their roles. So a data analyst, for example, might need to be able to read and work with and analyze and communicate data. But someone who works on the front line in an organization might just need to be able to interpret data visualizations or work with data in one particular aspect. But that person could still be considered data literate. And data mature organizations also offer training and support to help employees enhance their data literacy skills. And that helps data literate employees know what data is relevant to their role, while at the same time having a comprehensive understanding of the data within the organization. And I've done a lot of data literacy training myself. And in my opinion, it's an area where many employees today recognize that they need more expertise in. And from my experience, people at multiple levels of the organization tend to be very eager to learn more about data, or sometimes just gain confidence. And training in this area can also engender a wider understanding of the importance of data and an enthusiasm for doing more with data in the future. So how do you figure out where your business is on the scale of data maturity? And once you find out, what do you do next? The first step is to assess your organization's current level of data maturity. And Pragmatic Institute has created a data maturity assessment that allows you to quickly and easily do this. And ideally, data maturity assessment should be taken by many people within the organization, everyone, if you can achieve that. Because that will help you get a reliable view of what is going on in the organization and how people perceive these different pillars of data maturity in your own business. And so you shouldn't just have the data team, for example, assess the data maturity of the organization, but you need to have that done also by people in multiple roles. The next step is to identify gaps. These would be gaps in the features or pillars of data maturity. These would be features that are not present in your organization, or they might be at a very beginning stage. And another thing that I would recommend is to look for and identify any discrepancies that you might see between groups or departments or people with different roles in the same area. You might find that your managers perceive the organization as being very data literate, but maybe the people on the front line differ. And you need to wonder about that and really reflect on your data maturity level and think of what could be done to raise that level or maybe make it more consistent across the organization. And knowing this, you can then work toward incremental improvement in areas where you see gaps or discrepancies. One thing that I would point out is that you won't likely transition to data decisive overnight, depending on where you start out. And it's important to keep in mind that this will take time and that not all incremental improvements can be measured, at least in the early stages, in terms of financial benefits. For example, your organization might take a few years to realize a net positive return on investment in terms of the effects of increased data maturity, especially if you have implemented significant change initiatives or employee training or different kind of data systems. And often the greatest benefits or impacts that might be identified at the earlier stages of growth might be improved customer or employee experiences or greater differentiation on the market, or maybe an increased level of innovation and experimentation within the organization, even before you see a concrete return on investment. And then, after you have worked toward increasing the data maturity and you've monitored how you're doing, it's important or very useful to reassess your data maturity to get a measure of growth. And I would have to say to start the cycle of continuous improvement over again, maybe, at a smaller level, but we're always improving. So I think continuous improvement is very important. And how do you figure out, where your data or your business is on the scale of data maturity? We have developed here at Pragmatic Institute a data maturity assessment. I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but this instrument, the assessment, is available online. It's short. It's got 24 user-friendly, practical questions that ask people to rate their organization on some very concrete features and practices that they may have observed or participated in the organization. As I said before, I would recommend that you ask all or many employees to take the data maturity assessment. It's certainly appropriate for employees in multiple roles. So you could have people take it individually, and then you would aggregate it to the organizational level, or maybe you would want to look at different departments as well. And you could use this to pinpoint your current level of data maturity. And here you can see the link to our data maturity assessment. And you may take the assessment and you may find that in certain areas you are not up to speed. You might identify certain pillars that are lacking or maybe not strong. You might be at the data conscious level and want to get to data informed or data decisive. So I'm going to talk briefly about some steps that you can take to become more data mature. And the first one I call walk the walk. And again, this refers to the leaders. Some of you may be leaders of organizations here in the webinar. And it's important that the leaders don't just sponsor data initiatives, that they own them. And one way that they can show this is by demonstrating their commitment to data, by attending data trainings and workshops, by being involved in the execution of new data initiatives, by encouraging new ways of working, listening to diverse perspectives, and meeting frequently with business and analytics staff to see what they're working on. I would also recommend that leaders sponsor and support data knowledge sharing and showcase events that, like I mentioned a little bit early, that they publicly acknowledge and celebrate data initiatives and outcomes, and generally create an effective environment for data and data use. Another important step to becoming more data mature, if you found you're lacking in some areas, is to encourage that culture of experimentation that I mentioned before. And you probably have experienced this yourself, but data projects and data products are rarely perfect in the first iteration. They usually require multiple iterations, and they benefit from the view of failure as a learning opportunity and not a fatal error. So for example, if your company or a group decides to try to use data to predict future sales, this might be an initiative that your company sets out on to use data to predict future sales. And you may find out that the data available doesn't have any predictive accuracy. So you just can't use it to predict future sales at all. And something like this should be viewed not as a failure, but something that can be used to build your experience. And it should be viewed as a learning opportunity to help the company understand what to do differently, maybe next time or from now on. And I have found that this in my own experience, at one university where I worked, we wanted to know if there were, we wanted to know more about the students who actually finished an undergraduate program and graduated, as opposed to those who abandoned or dropped out early. And we had data on the students, data from their applications from before they were enrolled. We had all their course taking data and their grades and a whole host of things. We knew whether they had graduated or not. And we thought that we wanted to look at the data to see if there were profiles of students that would be helpful for us to understand more fully, what's the profile of a student who does finish or does graduate versus one who doesn't, or, we were looking at a number of factors. And we found that we couldn't identify any segments or profiles at all because our data was incomplete. We weren't collecting the right data. And so in a sense, we failed at that particular initiative, but the exercise was really useful in terms of thinking, what do we need to do in the future? What kind of data do we need? Another thing that I would recommend in terms of this culture of experimentation is to start small. Because if you start small, the risk of, if you do fail, the impact is maybe not as serious as if you had initiated a huge project, but you can also learn a lot in the process. And so, for example, if your company wants to build a comprehensive data dashboard, it might be wise to start with a small prototype, a dashboard of just, certain kinds of data, so that you can get feedback from users and explore how it's best used before you build the large end product. Another step that you can take today to becoming more data mature is to democratize your data. And data democratization means that data is accessible to employees, something that we have talked about already today. And so some of the steps we'd recommend would be to maybe, conduct a census of the data, find out what is the range of data in our organization, maybe create a data dictionary if one doesn't already exist, and disseminate it to employees so that they understand what data is used in the business or what's available in the first place, and help break down the boundaries that might exist between departments and business units and geographies and other divisions you might have in your organization. And this will help employees feel more accountable for the data they can access and personally responsible for that data. Another important step is to institute a structured process toward gaining insight from data and using it to make decisions. And here at Pragmatic, we use what we call the Pragmatic Data Insights process. And it's a process to structure data projects kind of from beginning to end. And it is something that data teams and their business partners work on together. And it's important to hold teams, both, from both sides of the business, accountable for using this. But we expect that data projects follow a certain process. Of course, there's iteration. If you move from one step to the next in the process, you may have to go back to refine things. But if there's a common framework that is applied to data projects, it really helps people end up on the same page. Another step that is very useful is to foster collaboration across teams and units. Break down those silos that may exist within the organization and with or between different data sources that could be available if you're not using a central source of data, which I certainly would encourage. And I don't know if you've heard the term recently. I see it used more and more, data evangelist. But these are data champions, people who will evangelize the use of data within their groups and demonstrate best practices and build bridges between teams. So it's helpful to identify and endorse these data champions or data evangelists because they can build bridges between different areas of the organizations. And I mentioned, a little while ago about the data day that we held at one organization where I worked, which brought people together from multiple areas to share not only how they use data, but also share the data that was pertinent to their areas and share interesting findings and have discussions about data from different areas of the organization that really could inform everyone. And my final recommendation, in terms of a step to become more data mature, is to prioritize data literacy in recruitment, in training, in promotion as well. And it's very useful to assess data literacy on the part of your employees and on the part of people that you might be looking at to join your organization. And it is probably going to be necessary to invest in data literacy upskilling for your organization and for your employees. But the more people can understand data and the findings that are shared with them and contribute their knowledge of the business to interpret data, the higher the likelihood of getting entire teams or multiple parts of the business moving in new and positive directions. And you might also want to consider some of the courses that we offer at Pragmatic Institute. There are the two courses that are shown on the screen, or at least the titles are Data Science for Business Leaders and Business-Driven Data Analysis. These are two courses that I teach currently at Pragmatic Institute. And Data Science for Business Leaders shows you how to partner, shows the leaders how to partner with data professionals to uncover business value, to make informed decisions, to solve problems. And it helps the leaders understand how they can contribute at each of the steps of a data project to drive results that have real impact on the organization. And it also includes guidance and tools for selecting data projects, building a data culture, and using data ethically. And the other course that I'm showing here is called Business-Driven Data Analysis. And this teaches a proven, repeatable approach that you can leverage across data projects and tool sets. It reflects the data insights process that I was telling you about. And it helps organizations deliver timely data analysis with actionable insights. And we focus on identifying the right business question to drive a data project, how to identify the right data to look at in a project, how to optimize results, and how to communicate them effectively and ensure stakeholder alignment. And it is very effective at increasing alignment between data teams and business stakeholders, which will strengthen one of the pillars that I described just a little while ago. So this is really what I wanted to share with you today. I hope it has been helpful to you to, think about what data maturity is and how you might assess it at your organization. What are the essential components of data maturity, and some steps that you could take to increase the data maturity where you find yourself now. So I think it's time for questions. So I will hand it back over to Rebecca.
Thanks. And I do know too that we are at time. So if someone has questions and they have to drop off, that's okay. You can send them to experts@pragmaticinstitute.com and I will get them to Susan because you don't want me to answer them. But we're happy to do it that way or figure it out too, because there was lots of great information, Susan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Susan. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you want more great conversations about data, check out our ongoing Pragmatic Data Chat podcast series, which is available on our site and your favorite podcast listening services. Again, if you have questions, feel free to shoot them to experts@pragmaticinstitute.com. We'll be happy to tackle those. But that does it for this edition of Pragmatic Data Chat. Thank you everyone for joining us and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.